Alright, let's go. Number 10. The Goose that nearly ended Apollo. On October 31st, 1964, NASA experienced its first astronaut fatality in the cruelest way imaginable. Theodore Freeman, a member of the third class of astronauts selected for the growing American space program, was piloting a T-38 jet on a routine training flight to Ellington Air Force Base near Houston. What happened next would expose a vulnerability no amount of training could overcome. As Freeman approached for landing, a goose struck the aircraft's canopy at over 200 miles per hour. The impact shattered the plexiglass windshield into thousands of tiny fragments that were immediately sucked into the jet's engine intake. Within seconds, the engine failed catastrophically. Freeman was an elite pilot, trained to handle emergencies that would overwhelm ordinary aviators. He attempted every procedure in the manual. But at low altitude with no engine power, physics became the enemy. The aircraft slammed into the ground at high speed, killing him instantly. The profound irony of Freeman's death haunts the space program to this day. Here was a man who had survived the brutal selection process to become an astronaut, chosen from thousands of elite military pilots and subjected to extreme physical and psychological testing. He was being trained to survive the vacuum of space, cosmic radiation, and the violence of launch and re-entry. Yet he was killed not by the cutting edge of aerospace technology, but by a migratory bird following flight patterns that had existed for millions of years before humans even dreamed of flying. NASA's investigation revealed the T-38's windshield, while sufficient for normal operations, had not been designed to maintain structural integrity when struck at precisely that angle and speed. The agency subsequently modified all training aircraft with reinforced windshields and adjusted flight paths to avoid known bird migration routes. But the damage to NASA's sense of invulnerability had been done. Freeman never reached space. He died before being assigned to a specific mission, his potential unfulfilled, his name largely forgotten outside aerospace history circles. What makes his death particularly unsettling isn't the tragedy itself, but what it represents. The space program had invested millions of dollars and countless hours preparing these men for every conceivable danger beyond Earth's atmosphere. They had contingency plans for equipment failures, medical emergencies, and even the psychological stress of isolation. But they couldn't protect against a goose. The randomness of it, the cosmic coincidence required for that specific bird to intersect with that specific aircraft at that specific moment, reveals something deeply uncomfortable about humanity's reach for the stars. We like to believe that technology and training can overcome nature's chaos. Freeman's death proved otherwise. Number 9. 90 seconds from incineration. On September 26, 1983, at Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, cosmonauts Vladimir Titov and Gennady Strekalov sat strapped inside their Soyuz capsule atop a fully fueled rocket, awaiting launch. The countdown had reached T-minus 90 seconds when ground crews noticed something that shouldn't be there: flames licking around the base of the rocket. A fuel valve had failed, and kerosene was pouring onto the launch pad, igniting on contact with hot surfaces. Within seconds, fire engulfed the lower stages of the rocket, spreading upward toward the capsule containing two men who had nowhere to run. The launch director immediately sent the abort command through the communication system. Nothing happened. The signal failed to reach the rocket. Engineers watched in horror as flames climbed higher, knowing that the rocket contained enough propellant to level the launch complex. They sent the command again. Still nothing. The fire was melting cables, destroying communication links, and the clock was ticking. Inside the capsule, Titov and Strekalov could see the flames through their small windows, could feel heat beginning to penetrate the hull. They had no control. The abort system could only be triggered from the ground. Finally, after agonizing seconds that felt like hours, the launch escape system ignited. Solid rocket motors in the escape tower fired with devastating force, pulling the capsule away from the doomed rocket. Titov and Strekalov experienced between 14 to 17 Gs of acceleration, near the absolute limit of human tolerance. The crushing force distorted their vision, compressed their organs, and turned breathing into a battle. For 3 to 5 seconds, they endured this punishment as the escape system dragged them upward at impossible speed. The capsule reached an altitude of approximately 800 meters before the escape rockets burned out and parachutes deployed. 10 seconds after they escaped, the rocket exploded with tremendous force, sending a fireball hundreds of feet into the air and scattering burning debris across the launch complex. The same pad that had launched Yuri Gagarin on humanity's first spaceflight was now a crater of twisted metal and scorched concrete. Titov and Strekalov landed roughly 2 kilometers from the pad, right at the edge of the debris field. Rescue crews reached them within minutes and found both men shaken but physically intact, though later examinations revealed bruising and minor injuries from the extreme G-forces. What makes this incident uniquely terrifying is how close it came to being a complete disaster. If the backup abort system had failed to activate, both cosmonauts would have died in the explosion. If the escape sequence had been delayed by just 5 to 10 more seconds, the capsule might not have cleared the fireball. The Soyuz T-10-1 incident remains the only time in history that a crewed launch pad abort has been used in an actual emergency, validating decades of engineering while simultaneously revealing how razor-thin the margins of safety truly are when sitting atop what is essentially a controlled explosion waiting to happen. Number 8. Tumbling into the atmosphere. On March 16, 1966, Neil Armstrong and David Scott achieved something no humans had done before. They successfully docked their Gemini 8 spacecraft with an unmanned Agena target vehicle, accomplishing humanity's first joining of 2 spacecraft in orbit. The docking was smooth, precise, a triumph of engineering and piloting skill. Then, minutes later, everything went catastrophically wrong. Armstrong noticed their combined spacecraft beginning to roll. His first assumption was logical: the Agena must be malfunctioning. Following standard procedure, he undocked from the target vehicle. But instead of solving the problem, separation made it exponentially worse. The Gemini capsule began spinning faster and faster, accelerating to approximately 1 revolution per second. At 60 rotations per minute, the spacecraft became a tumbling carnival ride from hell at 160 miles altitude, with no way to stop. The physics of what was happening were brutally simple. Thruster number 8 in Gemini's attitude control system had stuck in the firing position due to an electrical short. With the massive Agena attached, the stuck thruster produced relatively slow rotation. Alone, the lightweight Gemini capsule responded to the same thrust by spinning dramatically faster. Armstrong and Scott experienced G-forces of 3 to 4 Gs in multiple directions as the horizon whirled through their windows in a sickening blur. Their instruments tumbled uselessly. Spatial orientation became impossible. The human body can only withstand such conditions for a limited time. Blood begins pooling in extremities. Vision narrows and dims, a phenomenon pilots call graying out, the prelude to complete blackout. Armstrong and Scott had perhaps 60 seconds before loss of consciousness. An unconscious crew in a tumbling spacecraft cannot recover. They would have continued spinning until atmospheric re-entry, where aerodynamic forces would have torn the capsule apart. Armstrong made a decision that saved their lives, but ended their mission. Mission rules strictly forbade using the re-entry control system, except during atmospheric re-entry. It was a separate system with its own fuel supply, reserved exclusively for the final critical phase of returning to Earth. But Armstrong recognized they were seconds from death. He activated the RCS thrusters. The system, designed for controlling re-entry, had enough authority to gradually slow the violent rotation. Over several tense minutes, Armstrong regained control and stabilized the spacecraft. But mission rules were absolute. Once the RCS was activated, immediate return to Earth became mandatory. The mission that should have lasted 3 days ended after just 10 hours and 41 minutes. They had consumed 75% of their re-entry fuel just stopping the spin, leaving minimal margin for the actual re-entry itself. The landing occurred in the Pacific Ocean, in an unplanned recovery zone 500 miles east of Okinawa. Post-mission investigation identified the stuck thruster and its electrical short. But what haunts the incident is the cascade of assumptions that nearly killed 2 astronauts. The stuck thruster could have been detected if they'd had better diagnostic displays. The decision to undock, perfectly logical based on available information, transformed a manageable problem into a life-threatening emergency. And Armstrong's choice to violate mission protocol while correct raises an uncomfortable question. How many other absolute rules in spaceflight exist that might need to be broken to survive? Number 7. When computers said no at 3,000 feet. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin guided the lunar module Eagle toward the surface of the moon, preparing to accomplish what no humans had ever attempted. The descent was proceeding nominally when, at approximately 3,000 feet above the lunar surface, the computer display suddenly lit up with an alarm code neither astronaut had ever seen in training. The numbers 1202 flashed on the DSKZ, the display and keyboard interface that served as their only communication with the Apollo guidance computer. Seconds later, the alarm repeated. Then came 1201. The computer was having a crisis, and they were still descending toward the moon. In mission control in Houston, 26-year-old guidance officer Steve Bales had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine the fate of the Apollo program. The alarm codes indicated executive overflow. The computer was attempting to perform more tasks than it could handle in its processing cycle, and was shedding lower priority jobs to focus on critical functions. But nobody had seen these specific alarms during the hundreds of hours of training simulations. Flight director Gene Kranz demanded an immediate call: abort the landing or continue. Bales consulted consulted with Jack Garman, a 24-year-old engineer in the back room, who had handwritten a list of computer alarm codes after a simulation months earlier had revealed gaps in their collective knowledge. Garman confirmed that 1202 and 1201 were overflow alarms, not system failures. As long as the alarms were intermittent rather than continuous, the computer was managing the overload and could continue functioning. Bales made the call. "We're go on that alarm." The Apollo guidance computer was operating at approximately 85% of its maximum capacity. Post-mission analysis would reveal that the problem stemmed from the rendezvous radar being left in auto mode when it should have been switched off. The radar was continuously searching for the command module orbiting above, feeding unnecessary data to the computer, while the landing radar simultaneously provided descent information. The computer was executing a delicate balancing act, prioritizing critical guidance calculations while dropping non-essential tasks. What makes this moment truly terrifying is how close they came to complete failure. Engineers later calculated that if the computer had reached approximately 93 to 95% capacity, it would have been unable to continue functioning. At that threshold, the guidance system would have crashed entirely, leaving Armstrong and Aldrin in a powerless descent toward the lunar surface, with no way to control their trajectory. The margin between the greatest achievement in human history and catastrophic failure was less than 10% of a computer's processing capacity. The computer had less processing power than a modern digital watch, a 43 kHz processor with 2048 words of RAM. Yet it was being asked to perform guidance calculations, control thruster firing, process radar data, manage displays, and maintain communications, all simultaneously while descending toward an alien world. That it succeeded at all is remarkable. That it succeeded while operating at 85% capacity, with just 8% margin before total failure, reveals how precariously humanity's moonshot balanced on the edge of disaster. Number 6. The secret tumble. Nobody knew. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to leave Earth's atmosphere, orbiting the planet in the Vostok 1 spacecraft and returning safely after 108 minutes in space. The Soviet Union celebrated the achievement as a flawless demonstration of communist technological superiority, broadcasting triumph to the world. But behind the propaganda lay a secret so disturbing that it remained hidden for 30 years. During re-entry, Gagarin came within minutes of dying in a way no one had anticipated. At approximately 110 kilometers altitude, as Gagarin's spherical re-entry capsule began its descent through the upper atmosphere, the spacecraft's computer sent the command to separate the re-entry module from the equipment module. Explosive bolts fired as designed, but the two modules did not separate cleanly. Umbilical cables and connectors that were supposed to release remained attached, tethering the spherical capsule to the cylindrical equipment section behind it. As the spacecraft entered the thickening atmosphere, aerodynamic forces began acting on the awkwardly connected modules in different ways. The re-entry module, designed to descend heat shield, first in a stable orientation, found itself yanked and twisted by the equipment module still attached behind it. The entire assembly began tumbling violently. Gagarin experienced crushing G-forces from multiple directions as his capsule rotated end over end. The small viewing port showed the horizon spinning wildly. Earth, space, in nauseating succession. He had no control. The Vostok spacecraft was fully automated, and there was nothing Gagarin could do but endure. What makes this terrifying is the thermal environment. During atmospheric re-entry, temperatures on the heat shield exceed 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit as air molecules compress and friction converts kinetic energy to heat. The re-entry module was designed to present its thick ablative heat shield to the plasma stream, protecting the capsule and its occupant. But tumbling meant that non-shielded areas, sections with much thinner insulation, were being exposed to temperatures that could burn through the hull. In some accounts, Gagarin reported seeing flames through gaps in the spacecraft structure, though this detail remains disputed. For approximately 10 minutes, the first human in space could only wait and hope that the connecting cables would fail before the heat destroyed his capsule. The forces and temperatures were extreme, far beyond what the cables were designed to withstand. Metal and insulation heated, stressed, weakened. Finally, at approximately 7 kilometers altitude, the cables burned through. The modules separated. Gagarin's capsule stabilized immediately, heat shield properly oriented. The parachute deployment sequence initiated. At 7 kilometers, Gagarin ejected from the capsule as designed. Vostok cosmonauts did not land inside their spacecraft but parachuted separately and touched down safely in a farmer's field. The Soviet space program immediately classified the entire incident. Official accounts described a perfect mission with no anomalies. When the public finally learned the truth after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, engineers could look back with horror at how close humanity's first spaceflight came to ending in catastrophe. But what's even more disturbing is that the same separation problem occurred on Vostok 2 with German Titov, then again on subsequent missions. The Soviets knew they had a systematic design flaw, yet continued launching cosmonauts while concealing each near disaster. How many other critical failures has the fog of Cold War secrecy hidden from history? Number 5. The collision that punctured space. On June 25, 1997, Russian cosmonaut Vasily Tsiblyev sat inside the Mir space station, attempting to manually dock an unmanned Progress cargo spacecraft using a system called Toru. The remote control interface resembled a video game, displaying grainy black and white video from cameras on the approaching Progress. But unlike a video game, there were no distance indicators, no closure rate displays, no second chances. Tsiblyev had to judge the approach using only visual reference, squinting at a small monitor while operating crude hand controls. He misjudged the speed. The Progress M34 struck Mir's Spectre module at approximately 2 meters per second. The impact wasn't dramatic by terrestrial standards, about 4 miles per hour, the speed of a brisk walk. But in the unforgiving environment of space, it was devastating. The collision punctured the Spectre module's hull, and air began rushing out into the vacuum. Pressure alarms screamed throughout the station. The crew, Tsiblyev, flight engineer Alexander Lazutkin, and NASA astronaut Michael Foale, had perhaps 90 seconds before the station's atmosphere would drop below survivable levels. The immediate problem was the hatch. Multiple cables ran through the opening between Spectre and the rest of the station. Power cables, data connections, equipment tethers. The hatch couldn't close with the cables in the way. Lazutkin grabbed cutting tools and began frantically severing cables while Foale gathered critical equipment, and Tsiblyev prepared to seal the module. They had no time for careful procedures or proper documentation. Every second, more air escaped. They could hear it, a hissing that grew louder as the breach continued, venting their atmosphere into space. With approximately 20 seconds of margin remaining, they cut the final cables and slammed the hatch shut, spinning the locking mechanism to create an airtight seal. The hissing stopped. Pressure stabilized. 3 men stood in the dim station, breathing hard, realizing they had just survived the most serious space station emergency in history. But the crisis wasn't over. The collision had also damaged Mir's solar arrays, and the station had lost approximately 40% of its electrical power. In the hours that followed, Mir began tumbling slowly, its remaining solar panels unable to maintain orientation toward the sun. What followed were weeks of desperate measures, internal spacewalks attempting to reconnect power cables from the sealed Spectre module, creative routing of temporary power lines, and constant management of the station's limited electrical capacity. Spectre was never reopened. It remained sealed and depressurized for the rest of Mir's operational life, a tomb containing scientific equipment, experiments, and Michael Foale's personal belongings, all sacrificed to save 3 lives. The module that had cost hundreds of millions of dollars and represented years of scientific research became nothing more than ballast, a reminder that in space, even a walking speed collision can create catastrophe. The margin between routine operations and immediate death isn't measured in dramatic explosions or violent forces. Sometimes it's measured in the 20 seconds it takes to cut cables and close a hatch. Number 4. Houston, we've had a problem. On April 13th, 1970, at 55 hours, 54 minutes, and 53 seconds into the Apollo 13 mission, astronaut Jack Swigert performed a routine procedure, stirring the cryogenic oxygen tanks to prevent the super cold liquid from settling into layers. He flipped the switch. In the service module, a heater activated inside oxygen tank 2. Then came a sharp bang that reverberated through the spacecraft. Warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel. Commander Jim Lovell looked out his window and saw something that shouldn't be there. A stream of vapor venting into space from the service module. 205,000 miles from Earth, accelerating away from home on a trajectory to the moon, Apollo 13 was dying. The explosion had destroyed oxygen tank 2 completely and damaged tank 1, which was now slowly leaking its contents into the void. The oxygen wasn't just for breathing, it fed the fuel cells that produced all of the spacecraft's electrical power, and as a byproduct, all of its water. Within hours, the command module Odyssey would be a dead, frozen shell. The crew had to make an immediate decision: abandon the command module and retreat to the lunar module Aquarius, using it as a lifeboat for the journey home. But the mathematics were impossible. The lunar module was designed to support 2 astronauts for 2 days during lunar landing operations. Now it had to keep 3 men alive for 4 days on the long coast back to Earth. Mission Control began calculating power budgets. The numbers were devastating. The lunar module had 60 amperage hours of power available. The minimum required to get home was 300 amperage hours. They would have to operate at 20% of minimum requirements, shutting down every non-essential system, including most heating, turning the spacecraft into a barely powered shell coasting through the void. Then there was the carbon dioxide problem. The lunar module's environmental system used round lithium hydroxide canisters to remove CO2 from the air. The command module used square canisters. The two were completely incompatible, and the lunar module's supply wasn't sufficient for 3 men over 4 days. Without a solution, carbon dioxide levels would rise to toxic levels, 15,000 parts per million, then 30,000, then 50,000, where cognitive function collapses and death follows. Engineers at Mission Control had to invent an adapter using only materials available on the spacecraft: plastic bags, cardboard, tape, and hoses. They radioed instructions to the crew, who built the improvised life support system, while CO2 levels climbed toward dangerous thresholds. Navigation presented yet another nightmare. The explosion had damaged the spacecraft's guidance platform, making normal navigation unreliable. The crew would have to perform engine burns using manual calculations and visual references, sighting on the Earth's horizon through the lunar module's small windows to determine their orientation. The lunar module's descent engine had never been designed for the kind of trajectory corrections they needed to make. Every calculation had to be perfect. One error in the burn duration, one mistake in the angle, and they would miss Earth entirely, sailing past the planet into an eternal orbit around the sun. 3 men entombed in a frozen spacecraft, their air running out as they drifted through space forever. The horror of that potential fate drove every decision, every calculation, every desperate measure taken over the next 4 days. Number 3, 77 tons of uncertainty. In late 1978, NASA began tracking something that filled them with quiet dread. Skylab, America's first space station, had been abandoned in 1974 after its final crew departed. The plan had been for the space shuttle, then under development, to boost Skylab to a higher orbit in 1979, extending its operational life and using it as a testbed for future missions. But the shuttle's development had fallen behind schedule, and Skylab was falling faster than predicted. The culprit was solar activity. The sun's 11-year cycle was approaching its peak, heating Earth's upper atmosphere and increasing drag on objects in low orbit. Skylab's massive structure, 77 tons of aluminum, equipment, and experiments, was being pulled inexorably downward, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The space station had no propulsion system capable of raising its orbit. It had some limited attitude control gas remaining, which could potentially be used to change when it would re-enter, but not where. As 1979 progressed and Skylab's orbit continued decaying, NASA attempted to use that remaining gas to orient the station in a way that might shift its re-entry time, but the control authority was minimal, and the uncertainties were massive. The station was tumbling, which made aerodynamic predictions difficult. Atmospheric density varied by 50 to 100% depending on solar activity, which was unpredictable. Small errors in prediction early in the re-entry sequence magnified into thousands of miles of uncertainty by the time Skylab hit the lower atmosphere. By July 1979, the situation had become desperate. Skylab's orbit brought it over virtually every populated region of Earth. The uncertainty window for its impact stretched across entire continents. Engineers calculated that approximately 20 to 25% of Skylab's mass would survive re-entry, 15 to 20 tons of debris, including dense components like oxygen tanks and structural elements. These pieces would hit the ground at terminal velocity, with kinetic energy sufficient to punch through buildings and kill anyone in their path. NASA's public relations team tried to downplay the danger, noting that the statistical probability of any individual being hit was extremely low. But statistics offered little comfort when the impact zone potentially included New York, London, Paris, Beijing, and dozens of other major cities. The final week before re-entry was excruciating. NASA's predictions narrowed the window, but couldn't eliminate the uncertainty. Even on the final day, they could only predict re-entry time within plus or minus 5 hours. Given that Skylab orbited Earth every 90 minutes, a 5-hour window meant the impact zone could be anywhere along half the planet's surface. Television news tracked the falling space station obsessively. Some communities in the potential impact path discussed evacuation procedures, though the logistics of evacuating millions of people made such plans essentially impossible. On July 11, 1979, Skylab finally entered the atmosphere over the Indian Ocean. Witnesses on ships and aircraft saw a spectacular light show as the massive structure broke apart, pieces glowing white-hot as they tore through the upper atmosphere. The debris field began in the ocean but extended across Western Australia. Chunks of metal rained down across the sparsely populated outback. Pieces of America's space station scattered across nearly 1,000 kilometers. One chunk landed approximately 20 feet from a house. Another fell near a roadhouse. If re-entry had occurred just one orbit earlier, 90 minutes sooner, the debris would have struck North America's east coast, potentially causing casualties and property damage across a densely populated region. The margin between harmless desert impact and potential catastrophe was 90 minutes of orbital mechanics and the unknowable variations in atmospheric density that even NASA's best models couldn't predict with certainty. Number 2. The solar arrays that wouldn't stop shaking. On April 25, 1990, the Space Shuttle Discovery released the Hubble Space Telescope into orbit 340 miles above Earth. The deployment represented the culmination of decades of planning and $2.5 billion of investment. Humanity's most sophisticated optical instrument designed to peer deeper into the universe than ever before. But as the telescope's solar arrays began unfurling from their storage drums, engineers in mission control watched the announce something that made their blood run cold. The 40-foot panels were shaking violently, flexing and oscillating with forces they hadn't been designed to withstand. The arrays were supposed to deploy smoothly, unrolling like window shades to provide electrical power for the telescope's systems. Instead, they were experiencing severe vibrations as they transitioned from the cold darkness of the payload bay into direct sunlight. The temperature differential from minus 200 degrees Fahrenheit in shadow to plus 200 degrees in sun was causing differential thermal expansion across the array structure. The panels flexed, creating waves of motion that resonated through the framework. The oscillations fed on themselves, building in amplitude with each cycle. The crew and mission control faced a nightmare scenario. If the arrays tore off or became damaged, Hubble would have no power. The telescope's batteries could sustain operations for only a limited time. Without functioning solar arrays, the most expensive scientific instrument ever built would become an inoperable 24,000-pound piece of orbital debris. The space shuttle couldn't retrieve it. Hubble was too massive, and the orbital mechanics too complex for a safe capture and return. If the arrays failed, years of development, billions of dollars, and the dreams of astronomers worldwide would be finished before observations even began. In real time, engineers analyzed the vibrations and developed a modified deployment procedure. Instead of continuous unfurling, they would deploy the arrays in segments. Extend a portion, pause to allow thermal stabilization, then continue. The crew executed this improvised procedure with agonizing slowness, monitoring stress indicators and watching for any signs of structural failure. The first array deployed successfully using the new technique, then the second. Both arrays survived, though they continued to experience thermal oscillations during operations, affecting the telescope's pointing stability. What the public remembers about Hubble is the mirror flaw discovered weeks later, the spherical aberration that left images blurry until a repair mission in 1993 installed corrective optics. But the mirror problem, while embarrassing, was always fixable with a servicing mission. The solar array crisis could have ended Hubble immediately and permanently. No amount of corrective optics could help a telescope with no power. The incident revealed something uncomfortable about humanity's most ambitious space projects. They balance on knife edges of thermal engineering, structural dynamics, and real-time improvisation. How many other single points of failure lurk in our spacecraft, waiting for precisely the wrong conditions to trigger catastrophe? Number 1. The fire that consumed the future. On January 27, 1967, astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee entered the Apollo 1 command module for what NASA designated a plugs-out test, a full simulation of launch procedures with the spacecraft operating on internal power. It wasn't considered particularly dangerous. The Saturn rocket beneath them held no fuel. They were still on the launch pad at Cape Kennedy, surrounded by engineers and technicians. The test was routine, if tedious, a long checklist of procedures to verify the spacecraft's systems. But inside that capsule, NASA had created an environment more lethal than the vacuum of space. The cabin was pressurized to 16.7 pounds per square inch with pure oxygen, higher than normal atmospheric pressure, and without the diluting nitrogen that makes up 78% of the air we breathe. In a pure oxygen environment at elevated pressure, materials that normally resist fire become explosively flammable. Nylon, Velcro, plastic, even the astronauts' spacesuits. All of it was fuel waiting for ignition. The spark came from frayed wiring beneath Grissom's seat, damaged during installation or testing. One tiny electrical arc in that oxygen-rich atmosphere, and flames erupted with terrifying speed. The fire spread through the cabin in seconds. Temperature soared past 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Nylon netting installed to hold equipment in place melted and burned. Velcro patches that covered nearly every surface ignited. The astronauts' spacesuits caught fire. In the first seconds, the crew realized what was happening. Communications captured their last moments. Fire. Then, we've got a fire in the cockpit. The transmission lasted 17 seconds before the heat destroyed the communication system. Outside the spacecraft, engineers saw flames through the small windows, but couldn't immediately understand what was happening. Then the pressure inside the cabin, building rapidly as materials vaporized and gases expanded, ruptured the hull, releasing a blast of flames and toxic smoke that knocked back the pad crew. The astronauts tried desperately to open the hatch, but it was designed to open inward. The increased pressure made it physically impossible to move against the force. The hatch mechanism required multiple steps to operate: release bolts, remove a protective cover, then operate the actual hatch. At normal pressure, the procedure took 90 seconds. Under fire conditions with smoke obscuring everything and flames consuming their suits, it was impossible. Outside, engineers and technicians struggled with the hatch for over 5 minutes, their efforts hampered by heat, smoke, and the complexity of the mechanism. When they finally forced it open, releasing a cloud of toxic smoke, all 3 astronauts were dead. The investigation revealed a spacecraft riddled with hazards. Investigators identified over 1,300 design flaws. Flammable materials throughout the cabin, wiring installed without proper insulation or protection, the pure oxygen atmosphere at elevated pressure, the inward opening hatch that became a death trap. The investigation board didn't just find mistakes, they found a systematic failure of engineering judgment and safety culture. NASA had been so focused on beating the Soviet Union to the moon that basic safety considerations had been sacrificed to schedule pressure. The Apollo 1 fire came within a breath of killing America's space program entirely. Public support wavered. Congress questioned whether the moon was worth American lives. Within NASA, some engineers advocated abandoning the Apollo architecture entirely and starting over. The agency faced a choice: redesign everything or give up the dream. They chose redesign. The command module was rebuilt from scratch with fire-resistant materials, a new quick-release hatch that opened outward, and a less flammable nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere during launch. These changes took 20 months and pushed the moon landing to 1969 instead of the originally planned 1967. But the deeper lesson of Apollo 1 wasn't about engineering. It was about the nature of spaceflight itself. We think of space as the dangerous environment, with its vacuum and radiation and temperature extremes. We train astronauts to survive those cosmic hazards. But the Apollo 1 crew died breathing pure oxygen at sea level pressure on Earth. They died in a fire, one of humanity's oldest and most familiar dangers. The spacecraft that was supposed to protect them from space became their tomb because of decisions made in conference rooms and engineering reviews, where schedule pressure and competitive urgency overrode careful analysis. 3 men burned to death inside a machine designed to take them to the moon, killed not by the unknown dangers of space, but by the preventable hazards of compromised engineering and organizational hubris. Their deaths proved that the most dangerous part of spaceflight isn't the destination. It's the assumption that we've already solved the problems that can kill us here at home.